That was fantastic. We'll move now to a panel discussion in the closing half hour or so. If Mike can bring everybody up, I think we have everybody here, apart from David, who's missing in action. I'm assuming he will be coming back to the table in a few minutes, at least. Um, I just had some questions which I sent in the chat before we started. And I guess because this is what people are going to be thinking out there listening to all of these experiences. Okay, how do we move forward? And I guess, and I'll leave this for either of you to kick off. What are your thoughts on how we go about solving these problems that we've identified within academia? We know that we're supposed to be there to be able to think openly and critically, and we know that that isn't occurring. But what can be done to get academia back to doing the job it was supposed to be doing, or perhaps it never did, but certainly the job we expect it to be doing?
I'll just say quickly, I think we have to do what we're doing here. I think we have to find ways to connect to broader movements. What I'm seeing here in my home state is at least a somewhat hopeful effort to connect the issue of free speech and censorship in the academic world to the broader fight of labor and working people. I think so. I think we do need some sort of outside pressure from broader movements to create a political will and a shift in political will and power if we want to see these institutions operate any differently or treat any of us any differently.
Hi, David. We were just kicking off with the first question I'd sent in the chat about how we think we might go about solving the problems that we've identified, or we've been talking about. How do we get academia back to, or get academia to function in a way that we expect it to, in terms of being a space for open, free, critical thinking, where people can challenge in a fundamental way governments, powerful actors, and so on?
I'm afraid that I think that game is lost. Yes, of course, we have to fight back. And, I hear Jared's eloquence about the state of Black studies and about the way in which culture represents the Black struggle. And, I can't help but put this into the context of global geopolitics. That the West is in terminal decline, it seems to me. And there's not really a lot we can do about that. We used to think, some of us on the left, in the 1970s or the 1980s, or even the 1990s, that there was a realistic prospect of fundamental social reform in this country, in the UK. Is there anybody who thinks that now? Is anybody? I mean, we have seen a massive attack on the left since the invasion of Iraq, attack on the anti-war movement, on the pro-Palestine movement, penetration of huge sections of the left by state and sometimes corporate actors, and of course also by the Zionists, which of course is always needs to be discussed. But in the last year and a half, what is it, since the launch of this special military operation in Ukraine, it's become apparent that the West is finished and that unipolar power is on the decline. The Russians have systematically dismantled 3 separate armies constructed against them by NATO, including especially the US, and that they have catastrophically lost that conflict. It now looks like the West is losing in Palestine. I know it might not seem like that because we see the ongoing genocide and the corpses of babies and children dragged from rubble and the bloodlust of the Zionists, of course, but that is all camouflage for the weakness of the Zionists. And I mean that, let me try and say this very quickly. The Zionists are in a position where they have to try and escalate. They can't really go directly into Lebanon because they know that Hezbollah would beat them. They can't deal with Ansarullah. They have to have the big bully in the block, the US, to deal with Ansarullah. But the amazing thing about this period is that the US can't deal with Ansarullah. The US is scared of taking on Ansarullah. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but really quickly, they launched this thing, the Operation Protect Prosperity, from which the French, the Germans, and the French, the Spanish, and the Italians immediately absented themselves, and then they let it be known through the pages of the New York Times, no less, that they didn't really want to take on Ansarullah because they thought that maybe what would happen is that the government of Yemen, Ansarullah, would sink US ships, and that's an extraordinary admission because it shows that the much vaunted power of power projection of the US Navy has been reduced to the existence of metal hulks in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean being targets for one of the poorest countries in the world. So there's no threat to Ansarullah from the US, and Ansarullah can perfectly easily sink lots of US boats because they have the weaponry to do it, which of course they got from the Saudis before the mass of the Yemeni military defected to Ansarullah. And of course, it coming from the Saudis, it originated from the US. So the US knows perfectly well they can't take on Ansarullah, and that's why they phoned them up and said, guys, we're about to bomb bases X, Y, and Z. You might want to, get your guys out of there, which of course is what Ansarullah did. So that's a long way around. I'm sorry for being long when I should be short. I'm saying, look, the US power is over and the West is over as a leading cultural and hegemonic and ideological force in the world. And we haven't really even started to mention this seriously, never mind come to terms with that on the British left. Probably the US left is the same. So I would say, look, yes, of course we can fight back. Yes, of course we may have some victories, but there is really no option but to factor in the way in which US power is declining and the power of multipolarity on the increase, of course, through BRICS, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians especially, but other powers too. So that's what I would say about this, that the old social democratic game, was finished in 1979 and it's not coming back.
Oliver.
May I just, thank you so much for those comments, David. I'd like to build on them, if I may. I think the general direction in which I'm going here, as I think yours was, is that those who would want to suppress us, to marginalize, to smother us, whatever words we want to use for this, they are, for the time being, they are losing. They are experiencing deep embarrassment. Maybe even, who knows? Maybe there will be an element of shame eventually. And I've argued recently that I put it in the language of counter-revolution. I've made an argument, and just recently in Propaganda in Focus, that what we're actually witnessing is a counter-revolution to developments that were beginning, that actually resulted from the West's own instigation of this period of neoliberalism and globalization, which was never really intended to do more than open up world markets for the primary benefit of the existing powerful hegemonic economies, but led to the extraordinary, and I think unpredicted, unforeseen, the extraordinary rise of China. And I think when that began to become apparent to the West, then processes of counter-revolution started to move in, and currently this process of counter-revolution, and you just referred to at least two of them, I think, David, maybe all three of them, but at least two, the three that I am focusing on is, of course, the proxy war between the United States and Russia over using Ukraine as a pretext. But the ultimate game is to break up the Russian Federation, the largest landmass in the world, the largest nation state landmass in the world, enormously rich in resources and so on. The West is greedy to suck on this given the poor economic returns that are now available in the established traditional capitalistic economies. And then number two, of course, is the West's investment of so many decades of energy and of Western resource in messing about since Project for a New American Century, essentially, which was published about 1998, 1999. Well, actually, way before then. I mean, you look at the history of Western intervention in the Middle East. Of course, it goes back to the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 to protect the interests of the Anglo-Persian oil company. And then you've got to even as early as even in the late 1940s, but definitely by the late 1950s, you've got evidence of CIA messing about, wanting plans to assassinate this or that leader in Syria, or this or that Ba'athist politician in Syria or Iraq. I mean, this attempt to, and so what we're currently seeing is maybe the culmination of all of this, which is the moving in desperate circumstances to prop up Israel, which ever since the overthrow of ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Israel took over from Iran the role of being, as Robert Kennedy is calling it, Israel is as an aircraft carrier for the United States to keep the Middle East in control. I typically use the word policeman. Israel is the U.S. policeman to keep a nuclearized Israel to keep the Middle East in control. So we got the whole Gaza thing. It's desperate. It's Holocaust-like. It's absolutely revolting in every conceivable way. But it's essentially ultimately about bringing down Iran and further propping up Israel. And then the third, of course, is all the chatter in Washington about the inevitability of the final conflict between the United States and China, using Taiwan as a pretext, and then Taiwan will become the next Ukraine, where hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese will die, just as Ukrainians have been dying in order to promote this Western hegemonic narrative of counter-revolution. Now, the thing is, they're losing on all three of these fronts. I think it's a losing game. I think Ukraine is very obvious now, particularly this week, given the collapse of Avdiivka along the combat zone, and what that will likely mean for the ability of Russia now to advance further towards the Dnieper. A lot of conversations, of course, we had about all of that. I think the tragedy that is occurring now in Gaza, we don't know for sure, but for the first time in my lifetime, it's become possible in relatively polite society to even talk about the reopening 1947, 1948 terms of the establishment of the state of Israel. Finally, at last, long sigh of relief, you can actually talk about that with at least some people. And I believe the International Court of Justice this very week is actually going to be talking back to, it's going to go back, its investigations, discussions are going to go back to, that's revolutionary. And it's a revolution of loss for Western hegemony. And China's not going anywhere. And the sheer scale of China, whatever economic problems the organs like the economists like to pretend are afflicting the Chinese economy right now, these are just pinpricks. These are absolutely nothing when given the scale of the Chinese manufacturing enterprise, we can call it. China now controls 35% of the entire manufacturing output of the world. China is not going anywhere, and ultimately China will win in any conflict, in my view. So, what have we got to be? Why do we have to roll over anymore? I mean, if we were up until now, if any of our colleagues were inclined towards self-censorship, why bother? The enemies of truth, of freedom of expression, the faggots for power in the intellectual establishment that helps support these ruling classes, they're crumbling. Now is the time to enjoy the possibility of intellectual and total freedom. And what's the worst that's going to happen? The worst that could happen is maybe they want to fire you. So what? Because I think David Miller's example shows that it's not pretty, it's not painless, it's pretty horrible, but you can win if you persist. If you think the best arguments, you think out the best arguments, you work with like-minded colleagues, you make use of the legal system in your defense. It just, I don't say just because I know it's easy for me to talk about things like bravery and courage, but come on, let's have a bit of fucking backbone. Okay, I finished.
I mean, I certainly agree. I mean, Western hegemony is clearly coming to an end, and you can see that, in terms of the distribution of, ideational, military, economic power globally, and so on. And this is creating, I think, a crisis in the West, a crisis within our institutions, and so on. I just wonder whether we're getting to the point now where it's becoming so blatant and so obvious that there is actually more capacity now for all of our colleagues who have remained silent on multiple issues, that sort of, do they start to wake up and smell the coffee, see that things are going to potentially start to change? And that creates conditions where you do get more openness going on within the academy. Maybe that's naive to think that, but as you say, that sort of, at what point are you going to speak up in all of this? I mean, in our field with war and conflict, Iraq should have been pretty clear that things were broken in relation to that, and everything we've seen since in Ukraine and so on, and Gaza and Israel. Confirms what some of us have been saying for a long time about the media's relationship to power and so on. So what more evidence do they need before people within the academy start to sort of speak out more than they have been? I don't know. I mean, do any of you get any sense that, amongst colleagues, that we are at that point that's okay? If we take this idea that there is a crisis of credibility now across the West, a crisis of credibility both in political leadership and institutions, is there any indications amongst our colleagues that that's leading to a kind of awakening, or is there just a doubling down? And what comes to mind here is the number of our colleagues in communication studies who are jumping on board with a disinformation narrative and soaking up the funding streams on that and so on. It's absurd, completely anti-democratic and anti-rational kind of sort of road to go down and so on. And so that's disturbing to see. But do you, in your experience, see any indication that there are people finally just waking up, conceding the ground and saying, yep, you were right all along, Oliver, or you were right all along, Jared, and we now need to sort of start shifting, as it were, the boundaries of our research and thinking? Are there any positive signs, any green shoots in there from within the academy? Jared, David's just messaged he's going to try and get back in. He had to leave. He's going to try and come back.
No, and I appreciate what
accused of being too optimistic and and so on. But is there any positive signs before we move on to perhaps some more radical alternatives for academics?
And I'm always accused of being the pessimist, and so this is a nice balance. But I don't. Because I take it. I mean, what Oliver and David have said is I take it hard. I think is largely accurate. But I'm just so no. I don't see the response coming from within the academic community. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm missing it. I hope I'm just bitter and jaded by my own narrow experience. but I just don't see it. I see, to your point, a lot of people, whether it is taking an opportunity for actual sort of material gain, or just simply the social acceptance of going along with either the dominant narrative or at least the silence of the critique. That's mostly what I see. And I see a lot of people not hearing, with all respect to Oliver's call, that message. There has been, I feel like, largely a return to self-preservation, and even abusing the particular already abusive realities of Black life and experience here in the United States to say, for instance, we don't have time to be concerned with Palestinians given our own suffering, as if the two aren't connected by policy and otherwise, or to see that one's own self-preservation is largely in solidarity with people struggling all around the world. So this, to David's point, this idea that many of us are being encouraged to tie ourselves exclusively to this U.S. state project as our salvation, even as it maybe not so quietly collapses, is part of the problem. And the internationalist wing of Black studies and Black radical politics that calls for a connection to and solidarity with other people around the world is being attacked. That notion, that concept is being attacked academically through media and otherwise. So that's why I'll just say again, I only see our hope with being connected with those larger movements within the academy. I just don't see it happening any more than I would argue as a former. Well, I was forced to serve a sentence in the U.S. military, but any more than I would argue that anyone from within the military is going to change that as that mission or the institution's mission. I just don't. That's going to have to be forced from outside of it.
Yeah.
Oliver,
Yeah. I mean, I've I don't know about Jared, but I started working in the States in 1998, and I've been associated in that time with three departments. Actually, both were two were departments of communication. I spent a longer, more period with in the department of journalism. I think overall, I guess I just have to confess to my astonishment, the overall conservatism, the overall insipidity. If that is an appropriate word. Insipid, yeah, insipid engagement with the outer world, which, when you think of it in the context of the journalism department, is just truly astonishing. This insistence just on focusing on the basic techniques of supposedly the basic techniques. I'm not sure they really are that basic of mainstream news gathering and news writing in the United States. So that is kind of, and to the point now where, for at least in my last two places of employment, I stubbornly, when the occasion arises, not because I particularly want to or enjoy or getting anything out of blowing my own trumpet, but if I'm given an opportunity to talk about stuff I am doing, books I am writing, people that I am working with, and of course these inevitably have to do with major political issues of our time, all I get is just a face of slightly bewildered colleagues who they don't seem to have a clue how to react or what possible comment they could possibly make. It is, yeah, it's astonishing, and it is a million light years away from that period. I don't know, am I the only one of us who is old enough to remember it? Probably I am. Of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the crescendo of indignation, of passionate engagement, of protest, and that I remember not just seeing the images of it from U.S. campuses, but that I also experienced in Great Britain at that time. Where has any of that gone? And how can we explain it?
Yeah,
how can we explain it?
Just quickly, if I can, similarly, yeah, I've spent, one of the reasons I'm in Black Studies now is because I was removed from the School of Communication largely for trying to raise a lot of these kinds of questions and critiques about how media and journalistic practice was being taught. But to that specific point, I mean, one of there is this history here in the United States. There's the Peril or Promise book by William Corson from the early 70s or late 60s, who was a white military official who took a position at Howard University, one of this country's most prominent HBCUs, specifically so he could write and study the relationship of liberation to the campus, and to figure out to find ways to get the students to focus on just becoming good middle class citizens, as opposed to using that privileged context to study about how the world is really working, how they might engage it. And then within the HBCU context, again, there has been this history of literally defunding the humanities and social sciences and increasing funding to the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, specifically with the idea of reducing critical thinking. And one of the quotes I use all the time, specific to my experience, was told to me by a former high-ranking administrator at my university who told me, quote, "Dr. Ball, your problem is you want to create new knowledge, and we don't do that here. Your job is to create menial laborers for the communications industry," end quote. So everything, David, I'm sorry, Oliver, that you're talking about is I maybe in a different generational moment. I fully get it, and I'm seeing it happen all over again. Insipidity, it is, if I said that correctly. It is, the insipid nature of it all is infuriating. So I'm sorry. Thank you. I just wanted to add that quickly.
Yeah, I'm sure it's been a long process. I'm thinking of Chris Simpson's The Science of Coercion. And he talks, I think it's in that book, and also another text in the 1930s, and you see the reordering of the field of communication studies, essentially because of the funding streams, trying to reorientate communication scholars to do the kind of work which should be useful for the US government as it went into a war and so on. And that almost sort of defined the field and so on. And all of these processes, they're all pushing in one direction ultimately. And these have become so well established over time. I do think just that there is this other aspect that's always struck me, and I see this because I continue to engage with a lot of people who are in mainstream academia as well as people who are out of it and so on. It's at this very human level. These credentials and these titles are so hard earned and become so precious to individuals that they when they're left with, do I want to look at 9/11? And run the risk of losing that title, and you think, no, I'm not going to do that. And so even though I know it's the right thing to do, so I think maybe there's a problem there with academia. Maybe academia, right, is too hierarchical. Maybe, and I know in the German system it's dreadfully hierarchical, and so you have professors right at the top, and then you have these people who are in it for about 6 years, and if you don't become full professor, you're out and you're finished, kind of thing. But that kind of hierarchy, I really think, works against, and it's allowed powerful actors to have exploited that kind of hierarchy to impose the kind of discipline that we see. And so if we were to go into this kind of blue sky thinking of, okay, if we're in a crisis of Western civilization, if all the institutions are hollowed out and going to crumble in one way or the other and so on, what can we envisage going forward, coming out of the kind of rising from the flames of all of this? And it would be a kind of academia which is far more open, less hierarchical, much more engaged with the wider public, possibly with political movements as well. And so you take away this kind of this thing that I think we all had when we start on this journey going into academia. They're the professors at the top, and you take your cue from them and so on. And that, you've already lost half of your ability to really be thinking critically and for yourself and so on. So I think, if we get through this phase of crisis and the end of the Western Empire and so on, and whatever happens to our institutions, that's the kind of thinking that we're all going to have to be doing in terms of if we can build something better out of this in the coming years. I was going to say, because this is an issue which we haven't covered at all. Of course, I've been involved in a number of organizations. I've also been involved in organizations which are sort of mixed with academics, looking at issues surrounding COVID-19 and so on. And there's certainly, in our field, we're very familiar, both in Jared's field, but also Oliver and I, in terms of international politics and communication studies. We're aware of the constraints and have been for some time. But certainly with COVID-19, there's a huge raft of academics from the kind of hard sciences who have experienced censorship and repression and so on, who've been questioning the COVID-19 response and so on. So there are many more academics now who are aware of problems around propaganda, how powerful actors basically suppress and coerce and so on. And there's certainly been, I'd say there is sort of a nascent grouping of almost, if you think of independent media, how independent media entities have formed and started to challenge mainstream legacy corporate media, etc. I think you got the beginnings of that to an extent with dissident academics forming these groups. And I'm actually working with a colleague, Tim Hayward, at the moment, just mapping the range of these academic sort of organizations or epistemic communities which are emerging outside of the mainstream, and where everyone's kind of like scratching their head saying, like, how are we going to develop this? But we need our own journals, we need to try and find our own funding streams and so on. There's sort of initiatives to set up new universities, for example. I know of one in the Netherlands, for example, which I'm involved in. And so there is that kind of activity going on, which I think is positive. And in the same way that independent alternative media have, to an extent at least, sort of given the corporate media a run for its money, I think these kind of emerging sort of independent sort of entities can give mainstream academia a run for its money. We'll have to see where that goes and so on. But I think there's definitely a lot of movement there. And I think in the broader context of if we are, and I think we are going through a phase of major change, both globally, but also in the West, domestically and so on, there are a lot of opportunities there, I think. And also, and certainly in terms of my own experience, a lot of opportunities to sort of keep on, because I still publish and I still work with mainstream academics and so on, but also have a foot in these sort of alternative epistemic communities. And I'm not totally pessimistic that we don't reach a point at which there's enough out there, whether it's the kind of the really controversial stuff that Jared, we've spoken about in OPS, sort of, do we engage with the assassinations? Mark Crispin Miller, of course, wants to give his inaugural talk on the JFK assassination, but all of the other assassinations, those big state crimes against democracy, 9/11 and so on, those issues are sort of ripe for the picking now and so on. And, maybe sort of there is enough kind of momentum developing at the margins to sort of engage those, and then to start to think about a fresh look at academia and how we're supposed to be going about sort of questioning power and doing research and so on. I don't know. We'll have to see where that goes, but I think there's a lot of activity and there's a lot of people doing good things out there, which is a source of hope. But I agree absolutely that we need to think of ways of how this could engage with the political movements that we're seeing. Because this is what we have in Germany at the moment. The German elite political class, the SPD, CDU, and so on, and Die Linke are looking extremely weak now, and there are sort of new emerging parties. And on the street, there's this huge gap between the German public and the political elite and so on. And I think that's that can be harnessed positively, or it can go in bad directions as well. But I think that's a sign of at least some potential for things to be improved. I'm not quite sure where David is. David is trying to get back in, but he might not be able to get back in. Given everything that we've been saying, and I did, again, this is sort of inspired by the fact that, I know there are a lot of mainstream academics watching this and listening in, and who will watch. And we all know what it's like trying to engage our colleagues with controversial issues and so on. And we obviously all said what we wanted to say about the state of academia. Practical advice to our colleagues still in the mainstream. What should they do? If anyone wants to offer that.
If I may, I think I can get to an answer to that question, Piers. Not a terribly satisfactory answer, but my starting point is a little exercise I did in a class I was teaching the other day, a communication class, which was simply to do a simple survey in the class as to what were the major information sources that they had utilized on the preceding day. And I even though I expected what I got, but I was still astonished to see that practically, well over 50% of all, I asked them to identify at least two sources of news style information that they had accessed the previous day. And definitely 60% of all of them were social media. Not of a particularly gratifying social media kind, Instagram and TikTok and and of course Facebook and so on. I think there were maybe sort of 3 or 4 references to what I recognize as fairly standard legacy media, various sports media references. Not a single reference to anything that I would myself identify and describe as an alternative medium. Anyway, as a class, we kind of discussed, well, what is the significance of this? And and 2 or 3, I think, good observations came up, and one of them was the random nature by which information is encountered by this reasonably good example of our more educated, perhaps more intelligent youth. I don't know, but a large number of them seem to be encountering information in the public of a public sphere kind in an extraordinarily random way, in a way which must create extraordinary obstacles to their mental ability to make connections, because there are no connections in this universe of information sources I think. So the conclusion I'm drawing to is there is something really worrying and deeply disturbing about the media, the media, the information habits, even of university students. There are maybe some good things as well. I mean, you might say, well, now, okay, so they are less exposed to the routine forms of propaganda in which practically all Western mainstream media engaged, and maybe that's a good thing. These are empty, these are pure minds. Well, they're not, of course, pure, because they've been corrupted in all other kinds of ways by entertainment media and so on and so forth. Where can I come up with a positive kind of conclusion to this? I think precisely what I did wasn't such a bad pedagogic choice. I should do this more often with all of my classes. I should do routine surveys of existing media practices, and I should have my students engaged in trying to make meaning out of what it is that we are discovering about ourselves and about our engagement with this kind of informational infrastructure into which we are born, and to see, can we identify any problems with it? And I guess that's it.
No, I would just want to add, I mean, oh, sorry, no, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm still interested in this. Okay, there's very good points, Oliver. I'm still interested in this. What do we say to our colleagues? Or let's put it another way: what would we say to a young person who's just starting out in their career in academia? We know everything that we've learned and all the constraints. And what do we say to that young academic? Do we say, yeah, learn how to navigate and play safe, or what kind of advice do we give in order to try and encourage them to do their job properly?
Yeah.
No, I mean,
or is
I
there
think
is it simply get out? Get out of mainstream academia, go and get into some kind of epistemic community where you can actually do the work you need to do. And although it won't have status and there won't be much money involved, you're better off doing that than playing the academic game and getting caught up and basically ending up really just manufacturing consent, etc., for powerful actors. I mean, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's to those who are already in their careers. I think everybody more or less knows what they can or quote unquote should do. You can follow your all the basics we were taught in grad school about methodology and checking our bias, and it can be developed in a way in a classroom that encourages and invites students to be critical thinkers without even necessarily taking much risk per se, particularly at the university level. I don't think it's particularly difficult to invite students to think more to their left politically or more critically, and it can be presented in a way that isn't necessarily a threat to or isn't inviting the university to crack down. I've encouraged folks who have asked my opinion on this, particularly starting in their careers, that listen, it's not much different than any other avenue of work. We all need, unfortunately, to find some form of employment at this point, pending revolution. So there are going to be limitations and efforts to limit attempts to be radical in any field, whether you're regardless of where you work. So the question just becomes, to what extent are you connected to radical politics? To what extent are you involved with movements beyond the university and your particular job? To what extent are you finding like-minded intellectuals and academics and scholars, if for no other reasons, just self-preservation, to make sure you don't feel like academia is often very isolating. We're encouraged to these isolating endeavors. Work with colleagues, I think, Piers, you've talked about it already, work with others in collaboration. Just to, again, not only self-preservation in terms of the career, but in preservation of one's own state of mind, because it will be challenged in over time. So, yeah, I think, So I don't know that it's just a matter, I think, of being honest with oneself and being principled. And the more that we are connected to outside movements and others doing this kind of work, I think it's easier to take positions that we should take. I think it's easier to raise issues within our classroom spaces that we should raise. I will say my students have been reporting the last 2 semesters that I am one of only a handful at most of faculty that they with which they interact, who are bringing up the issue of Palestine, never mind my actual overtly anti-Zionist perspectives. They're not, and my daughters in high school report to me that they're not discussing it at all, which I find unacceptable, both as an individual educator, or never mind my critique of the institution. So, and I will say that particularly here in the United States, where there are degrees, pun intended, of relative freedom, to not bring it up at all, to not encourage students to think about it and think critically about these issues is unacceptable. And that's just acting outside of just general principle, never mind self-preservation for one's career. And as I've said, there are infinite ways, I think, to do this in the classroom without, again, welcoming or inviting the overt levels of suppression. We're all going to face something. That's just the reality. It's just a matter of to what extent we're able to withstand it. And I've already, again, suggested ways that I think we can self-preserve in that way.
I don't know if you picked up the question, David. But we were just the question put out was, what advice would you give to colleagues still in the mainstream, given everything that we've been talking about and so on? Any advice, which might include just get out because you can't do your job properly, or is there more sort of advice which allows them to stay in and, as Jared was explaining, sort of navigate the minefields?
Look, I mean, I think that it's very difficult, and I understand that people find it difficult. I know that in my own case, that colleagues who wanted to speak out were told that they would be disciplined if they did speak out. And thus, very few have spoken out. And people find that very, very difficult. Some have left, of course, and others have found a way to deal with it. Still others, of course, it sort of absorb the ideas and come to believe. I mean, in my own case, what happened was that my colleagues didn't know what was happening to me. They weren't told. They weren't really allowed to speak to me, and it was, I can appreciate that they must have had potentially at least misinformed view of what was happening to me. And so I imagine it must have been a huge surprise when I won my tribunal, because they would have had a view which suggested that I had done terrible things, I'd been a bad man, I'd upset the students and all that stuff. But actually, people have to find a way to stand up. They've got to find a way to say, we might not have this view, we might not agree with David on that, but nevertheless, the point about this is that we're academics. We're supposed to believe in science. Even if we adopt some kind of version of post-structuralism, which in my view is anti-science, we still have to believe that something of what we say has some kind of bearing on reality. And there is no possibility of doing actual research and finding out actual things and reporting them if you are, if when you say them you are attacked by organizations like the Zionist movement. But it's not the only movement that threatens us. But you've got to find a way to stand up and to speak out and hedge it about with all kinds of qualifications if you want. But you've got to speak the truth. That's the bottom line. Otherwise, there is no science. I mean, genuinely, not just no social science, but no natural science either. There's no science, and that's the end, even of an imperialist society. An imperialist society depends on some measure of science, and if you have simply a kind of system going away from the possibility of understanding the world, what's going to happen is you're going to be tripped up.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely.
I would go further than that and say, actually, that's what in part explains the foibles of US empire. So that's what in part explains those many thousands of people in the US who believe in Russiagate still after all these years, who believe that the threat that Trump is a huge, massive threat, and we have to vote Biden as a result in order. Trump is not a pleasant character. He's a Zionist apart from anything else. But look, let's have a scientific understanding of how the different factions operate and how they relate to fractions of capital, yes, and how they relate to imperial strategies, how they relate to in the case of the US to the neocons. Let's properly understand that. Otherwise, you will find yourself saying, "Oh yes, Russia is going to be absolutely destroyed by this invasion of Ukraine. It's the end for Putin." And then what do we have 2 years later? But just the opposite, the radical opposite of everything that they were saying, because they've abandoned the possibility of science and they've confined themselves to ideology. I mean, you see that time and time again. We saw that with the weapons of mass destruction, of course, and many other examples.
Yeah, I mean, this is for me. I mean, for all of my optimism and so on, talking about sort of new epistemic communities outside, we got a real problem. And the point I made earlier about the disinformation industry, the disinformation terminology, which has now seized both the political classes but also academia as well. This is such a fundamental violation of rational debate. Decided that you can define something as disinformation or malinformation now, and then it has to be taken off the table and so on. This is the end of rational, as you say, scientific debate. And we are definitely in a very dark place. I mean, what we're seen what's going on in Germany at the moment is extraordinary in terms of what is allowed to be said in public. We've had CJ Hopkins being prosecuted for a couple of tweets criticizing a German health minister. And there's many more things going on in Germany beyond that, which are deeply concerning. And it is to do with monitoring people, monitoring what they're saying. And if people who are in public positions go outside of certain boundaries and so on, then there's going to be costs incurred and so on. And yeah, we are definitely in that kind of totalitarian phase. I'm just hoping that it's becoming so extreme. And of course, we see it with Julian Assange and what they're possibly about to do to Julian Assange. And that's all part of the same process of saying that there are some things you're not allowed to say and so on. And, that's a dark place we've gotten ourselves into. And going forward, there has to be some kind of, really strong, powerful, uncompromising restatement of what do we mean by freedom of expression? What do we mean by rational debate? And what do you need to allow that to actually happen and so on, to get us out of the mess we're in? And a lot of academics seem to be falling down quite badly on that front.
Yeah, can I nip in there? Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen the decline of the left as a result of this. And so that you have even in the UK, the anti-war movement was a kind of the shining star of left-wing activism in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, and beyond. But now over Ukraine, and then also in relation to Palestine, Stop the War movement, Palestine Solidarity movement, systematically, compromising on where they should be in relation to, in fact, where they were 20 years ago on the invasion of Iraq. And I think that's problematic. And you see, of course, then this kind of dissolution of the right and the left. And in the US, some elements of the US right moving away from Zionism, becoming pro-Palestinian in some respects. And that's a very interesting development. Of course, many of them are free speech absolutists, and they tend not to want to defend our freedom of speech. But, Glenn Greenwald's banging on about this every week, isn't he? That the right should be paying attention. They should be defending us as well. Actually, there's something very interesting going on there, I think. And to the extent that these people on the right can detach themselves from some of the very awful things that they believe, then there's some interesting conversations to have there. But of course, the problem with much of the left, it seems now to me, and certainly in the UK, is that it's not that it's controlled opposition so much as it won't oppose, it won't properly oppose. And so in relation to Palestine, for example, the cutting edge of Palestine, pro-Palestine resistance in this country is an organization called Palestine Action, which devotes its time to smashing up Israeli arms factories in the UK. That's anathema to the Palestine Solidarity campaign, who try their best to marginalize Palestine Action. But it's effective. And we need to be having a conversation about how to take effective action against imperial forces and against the arms industry.
Okay. We're coming up to time. Any closing comments? We've had a fantastic series of presentations and a fantastic discussion. I've got a few closing comments to make, but does anybody want to come in on with any final points?
Yeah,
I would just want to say. Go ahead, Al.
Sorry, Jared. I just picking up again from David. Your remarks about the changing character of the division between right and left in the United States. It is really strange. And now we see, so Tucker Carlson's channel typically has got an audience of 300,000 every broadcast. And of course, his interview with Putin, I mean, I've seen various figures cited for that. 300 million was one, and I even saw a billion. I don't know what credence to give to those figures. And yet, so we got these extraordinary phenomena, and then there are many smaller, less significant alternative sites that nonetheless still pick up more audience than most city newspapers do in the United States. I mean, 20, 30, 40,000 is nothing anymore in the world of social media. And yet, I guess this is it. I had this conversation the other day. I was I've been doing a postgraduate class for for Moscow Higher Education University, Higher Economics University, and it was precisely on this point. So why isn't the world changing then? Given that we got so many alternative media and they got such large audiences. And I think part of the answer seems to be still that the established Western media, they still have the resources. I mean, when you see Tucker Carlson, the day that Tucker Carlson starts investing his wealth in setting up a kind of Al Jazeera style network of hundreds of reporters around the world with bureaus in every capital city of the world and kind of reporting the world from within a totally different frame. I mean, that's what made Al Jazeera. I'm not saying Al Jazeera is I mean, it's pretty good actually on Gaza, but I have many other problems with Al Jazeera, not least the fact that it's financed by the Emir of Qatar and his family, and the same family that has invited in the U.S. Middle Eastern Command. It's this imbalance of reporting resource at a time when, even at the time when the mainstream media are crumbling. They're even we're right now we're going through yet another wave of dismissals in the news industry. It's pathetic, but yet that is still the best. These are still the best institutions as far as person power is concerned for the generation of new knowledge or new information, I should say. Knowledge, I'm not sure about, but new information. And very, very few of the alternative media even understand this business well enough to understand that is what they don't have. They don't have the credibility that strong resource gives you. I'll leave it at that.
Gerard, did you?
I was laughing out of fury a while ago when David was talking, because when the overlaps and parallels I'm trying to summarize very quickly, it's when David, you said, oh, now I think I just lost it. What is it that you said that made me laugh? The idea that Trump is some new fascist rise of fascism. So or this new boogeyman that makes us have to retreat to Biden as the only solution to our world's problems, as he supports genocide in Palestine and increased policing of everyone here, et cetera, and so forth. I was thinking I mentioned earlier the promotion of Angela Davis as a symbol, absent her connection to George Jackson, who in 1970 was already, in 1970 was already telling us fascism was here. So this idea that Trump is something new is for some of us on an actual quote unquote left insane. So similarly, when you mentioned Glenn Greenwald, I made a little note here thinking, one of my problems is that Glenn Greenwald, who said himself he was only really moved to the left after the Obama administration, which even for me makes him a brand new baby to radical politics or radical thought, to the extent he ever got there. He gains fame through Assange. Assange goes to permanent prison. Greenwald practically stops talking about Assange and moves farther to the right, and none of them speak about Mumia or pre-existing political prisoners. that is, I think, the summary for me, what is a concern, not only for my little wing of Black studies, but for what is called the so-called left here in the United States. That what is actually a left has been so marginalized and suppressed, it has been replaced and rebranded as anyone who at any time would have said anything maybe remotely supportive of Barack Obama, who has been nothing but a neo-colonial monstrosity from my humble perspective, and continues to play that role from his $40 billion mansion, producing media that is working against the work that all of us, I think, are trying to do. So but that's it. I just wanted to say that and say thank you all for this. And I really appreciate being in this space and building with all of you, and look forward to much more. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to, David, do you want to come in, or are you? Yeah, because we are coming up to time, and we have got a hard stop at 3 hours. Just to thank everybody. I mean, certainly the Organization for Propaganda Studies, Propaganda and Focus. We've got a network of academics. We've got listservs, 150 across 2 listservs of academics and researchers. I'm all in favor of building those, building the dialogue, and still engaging with the mainstream and so on. But I think sort of building this independent academia outside of the mainstream, I think, is the way to go, especially as we sort of go through these times of huge change, as you've been describing. So I want to thank everybody for your talks today and for the discussion, and thank you to everybody out there who's been tuning in and listening. This will be available on the Propaganda and Focus website, as well as UK Column, and probably in 1 or 2 other venues as well. So that will be up and available for viewing at some point in the future. But thank you to everybody, and thank you to the audience. Good night.